Thank you everyone for joining us this morning for the department's conservation lecture series. My name is Whitney Albright and I work in the Science Institute here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife and help to organize the lecture series. And as usual, I have a few quick announcements, ground rules before we get started, but we'll jump in here very soon. So by way of announcements, as you all probably noticed, you've been muted as you join the call. That's to help us keep the audio line clear for the recording. We are recording the webinar today, and it'll be available on the Conservation Lecture Series website, hopefully within the next few weeks. And the link to the website is here on at the bottom of the page. So if you want to view the lecture again or know of others that may have missed it, I do encourage you to check out the recording. As far as flow today, we're going to have a couple of presentations here from our guest speakers, and then we'll have time for dedicated kind of Q&A at the end of the meeting. Because we have a couple of different presenters, we might take just a question or two in between presentations. So if we do that, I do encourage you to go ahead and type your questions in throughout the presentations, and we'll relay those either intermittently or kind of at the end during our discussion section. Okay. So next up, please save the date for our next lecture in January. We'll be hearing from Dr. Morgan Tingley, and he'll be talking about the changing nature of fire and its impacts on California birds. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. That lecture will take place on Thursday, January 28th, also at 10:30 in the morning. And we will get out the registration links and materials, hopefully in the first week of January for you. So please check back on the website, and we'll also send out our announcements through our regular channels. So make sure to keep an eye out for that. Okay, without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our three guest speakers today who are going to be tag teaming these presentations. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Jim Thorne. And Dr. Thorne is a landscape ecologist at UC Davis, and he led the Vegetation Climate Vulnerability Assessment that was completed in conjunction with the update to the State Wildlife Action Plan in 2015. And the applications of his work were recently featured in a climate change refugia special issue of Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. So we'll be hearing a little bit more about that work today. And then we're going to hear a joint presentation by Dr. Melanie Gogol-Prokurat and Sandra Hill. And Dr. Prokurat is a spatial ecologist with the Conservation Analysis Unit here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife within our Biogeographic Data Branch. And Sandra Hill is a GIS specialist also with our Conservation Analysis Unit. And they use the vegetation vulnerability data to evaluate the extent of climate change exposure and refugia within the habitats of 522 terrestrial vertebrate species. And so they're going to be talking more about that work today as well. So please give a virtual welcome to all of our three speakers. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Dr. Thorne, to get us started.
Okay, great. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. So thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to get a chance to present to this group. And so we're going to dive right in. And the title is Conservation Applications of Vegetation Climate Vulnerability and Refugia Data in California. And I thought I'd start with giving you a little background. What was the motivation? Where did this data set come from? How, why? And then talk a little bit about how it's produced and what are some of the results from the statewide assessment. And then really I want to get into looking at different ways that you can use it. And so that'll be the part that I'm working on. And then Melanie and Sandra will be jumping in afterwards, and I'm sure filling in and providing much more context. So the background, in 2012 and 2013, the National Park Service was working on their NRCAs, the Natural Resource Condition Assessment. and I was involved with the one for Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And from the land managers there, the fire managers in the Southern Sierra, they were basically saying, we don't care if giant sequoia move to British Columbia. We do, but we're not moving to British Columbia. So can you give us something that gives some variation of climate risk on the landscape that we're working, so that we can bring all of our traditional management tools and use them, but look through a climate change lens? So what's the relative climate change risk? That's sort of where we started to develop this concept. So how do you do it? Well, we took mapped extents of dominant vegetation, and we classify how frequently a vegetation type occupies different climate conditions in current time. So you could imagine, say, blue oak woodlands, and blue oak woodlands occupy a wide range of different climates, but there's some that they occupy really frequently, and there's others that they're only occupied maybe 1% of the time. So you can identify from those current conditions the places that are stressful or not stressful based on the level of frequency that the vegetation type is occupying. So it's a little bit of a different approach from, say, a species distribution modeling approach. And then you track what happens inside of each grid cell that you've mapped as climate changes, and how, where does it move relative to the classification from current time. So here's the view of what the report looks like, and it was developed to support the SWAP program in California. And we also published a paper, so we have the report and a subsequent paper. So here's the map of the vegetation, the FVeg. In this case, we used macro-veg, although now we're using WHR types for much of the same type of work. So that's a different classification of vegetation. And you take that, and you take a bunch of different climatic variables, and you reduce the different climatic variables using a principal component analysis to 2 dimensions. And so what are those climate variables, I hear you cry? Well, we're using the Basin characterization model, which is a mechanistic model, and it starts with precipitation and air temperature that you see up in the center red circle there. And then BCM will run a snow module that accumulates and melts snow. And it basically it takes the precipitation and it fills the soil profile based from GIS with up to field moisture holding capacity. And in any given month, if you have more precipitation than field moisture can hold, that either becomes runoff or recharge, and those are dependent on the permeability of the soil and of the rock, and the model can be calibrated using stream gauge data. It also has an energy balance component, which basically calculates the potential evapotranspiration based on solar radiation and air temperature, and then says, well, that's limited by how much moisture is in the soil, so that's your actual evapotranspiration, and the difference is the climatic water deficit. The CWD from the Basin characterization model has been used in many predictive model studies as a predictive variable in many ecological studies in California. So here's what this kind of looks like at the macro-veg level. Here's one of the vegetation types from that map, this one being pine and oak woodlands. And what you can see is the color in this graphic shows the frequency at which that climate condition is occupied by this type. So everything that's in blue is up to 80% frequency. And we made the assumption that 80% was going to be non-stressful. You go out there, the climate conditions are typical for a mixed pine oak. And the places that are in red, however, are the last 1%. There's only 1 out of every 100 grid cells that's experiencing that climate in current time. And the orange is the last 5%. And we're going to make an assumption that the last 5% today is already stressful for these types. So, and this is just to show that every dot on the map has a dot in the principal component analysis. And once we've set that classification, we're going to hold the climate classification from current time steady, but we're going to see what happens to every grid cell. And so here on the right-hand side, that's the RCP 8.5, sort of our current emission level that we're at. Actually, we've surpassed it a bit. And this is a prediction to the end of century. And you can see a lot more red in the Sierra Nevada foothills there. And that represents all the grid cells that have pine oak woodlands that move into the last 1% of their current climate stress from the 1980 to 2010 time period. The black are locations where we don't have that climate anywhere in California today. So for this study, we took two different emission scenarios, the RCP 4.5, which is on the left, and the RCP 8.5 on the right-hand side. And we basically said, okay, we need to pick a couple futures. And typically resource managers don't want to see 18 different maps of what the future could look like. So please reduce that for us. That's one of the jobs that a landscape modeling people should do. And we wound up, so what this chart shows you, these charts show you is that the axis there is 1980 to 2010 average conditions for annual precip and minimum air temperature across all of California. The dots are different GCMs by 2100. And you can see that they all agree that it's warming, which is on the x-axis there. So all the dots are to the right of the center point. And that under RCP 8.5, they warm considerably more. And then above or below the x-axis is the change in precipitation by percent. We picked the red and the green dots, which are the MIROC and the CNRM, that approximately bracket California by plus or minus 25% annual precip. And when we use those two in the two emission periods, we go from about 2 to 4.5 degrees of warming. So, okay, we took that one vegetation type and we ran its climate classification in current time. Then we did it for every single vegetation type, one after another, and we can patch it back together. And here is what that looks like. It's a sort of a Rorschach chart from 1981 to 2010. Okay, well, what are the results from the statewide assessment? Here's what we really get into Rorschach here. So you have warm and wet on the top row, hot and dry on the bottom, and the RCP 4.5 that would require tremendous modifications in everything that we do is on the left, and the right-hand side is the level of exposure for the current vegetation by 2100. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, just look at the yellow numbers there over on the end. We can approximately have the impact across the whole state if we're able to achieve a 4.5 emission scenario. That's typically out of the hands of resource managers, but those are the blue numbers, and those would imply between 15 and 22% of all of California would be under an extremely high level of stress by 2100. But however, we are on between a 40 and a 50% impact. So if we stay on our current emissions by this analysis, we're looking at approximately half of all of California's natural lands being under high levels of climatic stress. What does that mean? Well, the vegetation might not be physiologically knocked out, but if a disturbance came, it might convert to something else. And so this little chart gives us an idea of the trade-off, and the different color dots are the different emissions. And I just threw it in there because you can see the change from the blue diamond to these dots that's the decrease in the part that's frequent in a non-stress class, and the x-axis is the increase in the proportion that's in the high stress class. Okay, well, so estimating vulnerability was the other part of the SWAP document, and I just talked about climate exposure. And climate exposure, I think, is the most useful piece of this vulnerability mapping exercise, but I'm going to just mention the other parts. And for sensitivity and adaptive capacity, it's interesting because if you're just working on a single species, you can get very specific about what are the sensitivities or the adaptive capacities of whatever species you're working on. But if you're looking at a vegetation type, say the mixed pine oak, then you would need to compare across all the species that are in that vegetation type to get the relative rankings. And so we ranked by relative about 170 plant species in California, dominant plant species. And we've got sensitivity and adaptive capacity for fire, germination, how many modes of dispersal, how long does it live. And an example of the difference between sensitivity and adaptive capacity would be if you have a flammable architecture or thin bark, you have a high sensitivity to fire. But if you have thick bark, you might have a lower sensitivity. And if you have the ability to stump sprout or serotinous seeds, cones, then you have an adaptive capacity. And so we do have maps of the vulnerabilities, but I think that the maps of the vulnerabilities, in my opinion, were a little bit too generalized for full implementation. And I like the exposure stuff much better. I threw this slide in just to indicate that there's somewhat of a publication train that's associated with this approach. And I'll show you a few examples of those, but that's really for your reference. So how does the exposure look if we pulled out, say, some red fir in the Central Sierra in baseline time, and then we go to 2040 and to 2070 and to 2100, you can see that there are parts of the existing range of red fir that become more and more climatically stressed by this metric. Okay, well, one of the papers that is doing this, that uses this approach, looked at the temperate forests of all of East Asia. And what I think is interesting for us about this is that, we looked at, it's equivalent to state level analysis, province level analysis in China, South Korea, North Korea, Russia, and Japan. And we found that there, out of all of the 96 provinces that comprise this geographic area you're looking at, there's about 50 of them that have some vegetation refugia for temperate forests, but it goes across their boundaries. And so they're going to have to be coordinating across boundaries. And California faces this all the time, particularly with the federal and state, that we have this need to do cross-boundary management. And then of the 96, 90 of the provinces have areas that will have high impacts to forests. And that is also, how do you handle adaptation in that case? Do you handle it, across these borders? Well, okay, so the paper that Whitney mentioned at the beginning that just came out is on vegetative refugia. And so we are now looking just at the RCP 8.5, the radiation concentration pathway 8.5 emission scenario. And we basically say, okay, the wetter and the drier models that we used, where do the refugia, the areas that stay within 80%, where do they both agree? And that's the areas that are in green on this map. And the areas that are in red, those are additional refugia if we get too hotter and drier. And the areas in blue are additional vegetation refugia if we get to a warmer and wetter future by end century. But the combination, and the reason that you combine them is because that gives the land manager the highest confidence that we can provide of these are the places that give her, plus or minus 25% precipitation and within a range of temperatures remain suitable for what's currently standing there by the end of century. So what do some of these things look like then? Another image from this paper is the lower and upper oak woodland types. So that would be blue oak woodlands down below and mixed hardwood conifer up above and montane hardwood in this case in the Southern Sierra. And you've got them mapped on the left side. And then what places remain refugia for both of those two types on the right-hand side. And you can see it's just along the upper edge of the oak zone remain in and particularly if it gets a little wetter, then there's more refugia there. And I threw this slide in because the yellow areas in the big image are the areas that are agreed on as high stress. And so we can also think about what do we do where places have high stress. And I'll unpack that a little bit more in the next slides. And I throw this one in because one of the things that we're talking about is how do our refuges and our protected areas behave climatically? And if you think of your refuges as, like we did in this paper with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges, they each one have a climate condition, and those climate conditions might disappear in the upper row of images, or there might be one other place that a climate might shift to, or you might have a climate in one protected area that emerges in multiple other ones, or it endures, or you have multiple protected areas and their climates arrive at another location. And so if you're looking at it from a network conservation perspective, then this might be an interesting idea. Okay, I think we're going to get to some applications. Here's the extent of the campfire. And so what do we do if we're going to deploy resources for restoration in a place like this? Well, we could take the vegetation map and we could say, okay, there's the current exposure values for the vegetation that was there. And then by end century, the right-hand column shows us that if we planted the same things, that we expect them to be highly climatically stressed by the end of century. And we could zoom into Cwhr Basin, which is an area that some of the Resource Conservation District folks and Forest Service are trying to do some work in. And you can zoom in a bit with this type of an analysis. And this type of an analysis really does also allow us to ratchet forward our understanding, because it gives us the ability to look at, in this picture, the green are the refugia or expected refugia off of the rimfire, and the red are areas that we would expect would be highly stressed by 2040. And so if you planted what was the dominant there, which was ponderosa pine, you replanted it. I have a spatial explicit assumption, a hypothesis that says, I think in the green area it's going to survive and in the red area it won't. And if it doesn't, and if either of those occur, then we've more or less calibrated this model correctly. But if they do just fine in the red, then maybe it's not the last 5%, maybe it's only the last 1% that is going to be sensitive, and vice versa. Okay, well, for tree mortality, then, here's the tree mortality map from our most recent drought in the Sierras there. And here's that tree mortality map with our exposure stuff underneath it. And so we might be able to start to make estimates of how impactful was the drought according to different projections of the mortality and the future climate change. So we haven't really unpacked that, but identifying the velocity or the overall speed at which our landscapes are being impacted, and tying that to the level of mortality to some future projection, and saying, well, by the time all of those black spots were in red, it was 2070 under the dry and hot future, and that would suggest then that the drought had an impact that was similar to what would be the average condition by 2070. So there's a possibility there to get start to understand what the acceleration effects of something like a drought might be. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes, I'll run out of time, but I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we're working on now for the Wildlife Conservation Board in collaboration with the Pacific Forest Trust, which looks at these 5 watersheds, now often referred to as the AB 2551, but it's the Feather, the Pitt, the McCloud, the Sacramento, and the Trinity rivers. And we wanted to bring our climate exposure component to look at wildlife connectivity and conservation in this area. And so I want to present a little idea of a framework. Ignore the word elk down there, but we've got our climate stress and current range on the left, and we're going to combine it with landscape fragmentation and landscape connectivity. we have these different types of actions that we can take on the landscape. We have connectivity projects, we have conservation projects, and we have restoration projects. And more or less everything that we do falls under one of those categories or more than one. And then there are other data sets that we could bring in: land conservation status, the vegetation structure from the California Forest Observatory, recent disturbances, maybe future models. And we can create indices of these things. And so what we've done here, I can't even see the upper center column is species richness by Whr category, now just rendered into a 5-level index. And landscape connectivity in the middle on the bottom is also rendered to a 5-point index, and canopy height on the lower left. And you can combine those. And so you can start to, and we've done this at a 10-hectare hexagon level. So we can start to emerge important locations on the landscape that have connectivity and biodiversity or structural values. And then we can bring in things like fire, that's in the upper right, or land use intensity here measured by linear length of road in every 10 hectares, and Whr type to look at various different applications for planning and management. So here's the FVeg data. Here's our emissions and stress by mid-century and by end century. And we can break that out and say, okay, where are the refugia? So on the upper row, the dark green are the refugia in 2040, 2070, and 2099. And on the lower row are the areas that go into the high stress categories by the same time periods. And then we can do a lot of different things. I'm kind of flying fast here, but I'm going to just try and squeeze it in. So here's refugia. And now we've taken Sierra mixed conifer and we've pulled in so all you're seeing now are the Sierra mixed conifer that are in the refugia are in bright. And then we've colorized it by the structure, the forest structure of that. So using the California Forest Observatory. And so if you were going after old growth in places that look like they might remain for long periods of time, then something like this might be an approach to go after that. So Brett Furness identified the 1,000 to 1,500 meter zone as an important area for neotropical migrant birds, seem to be moving into that. So we could ask, where are the refugia within that zone for all vegetation types? And where does connectivity intersect with the elevations of that at that zone of elevation in this region? We're also working on quantifying micro-refugia. And so we take and we have to do this at 10 hectares, right? And so that's our planning unit, our 25-acre planning unit. And on the left is you take the mean elevation and you identify the highest point in every cell, and you can identify how much cooling capacity that 10-hectare cell has before climate change would no longer provide you with the average climate anywhere in it. And on the right-hand side is a similar concept of how much cooling or warming does solar radiation provide. It goes from 0 up to 2 degrees in this area. So, and then you can combine those, and that's what's on the left. So the combination, you can see it looks much more hopeful when we just look at the environmental lapse rate, the topographic, but when we bring in solar warming on air temperature, we have some places that have still some blue, and you can see those, and then we can look at those. Now they're on the left-hand side, and we can also say there's a seasonal cold air pooling, and we want to model that. And so these are the places that have some localized resistance to warming on these landscapes. Okay, so connectivity, we combine two different connectivity models, the essential habitat connectivity and TNC's analog climate, but we didn't combine a lot of the other ones because they didn't cover the whole region. We turned those into an index. And so now here, what's in blue is a corridor, a high-ranking corridor. And what we can then say, okay, there's the high-ranking corridor, and here's the cooling capacity of every hexagon within that high-ranking connectivity zone. And so if we're looking for micro-refugia in a corridor, we may be able to start to identify those places, and they may suggest different management approaches at those locations. Here's the essential habitat connectivity with the same thing, and with the environmental lapse rate. And so then I think I'm gonna just jump. I think I'll have a couple more slides here. So here's the refugia and the high stress areas in green and red, and then we've dropped our highest ranked connectivity in the blues there for these. And on the left-hand side is 2070, but the exposure is 2040. And on the right-hand side, exposure is now 2070, and the refugia are at 2100. And I think that it's interesting to combine those. This is, I think, the last slide. And the reason you combine them not in the same time period is illustrated here. So here's the ACE3 potential species richness in blue to purple. At the north end, just below Shasta Lake, you can see there's a ton of purple there. So there's a lot of potential species richness. And by 2040, that blob of red is suggesting that by 2040, the vegetation in that blob of red is going to be under high climatic stress. That might suggest that the species that are in those locations may be trying to move out. Well, if they're moving out, they may be facing some blockage from Shasta Lake itself, but they may be able to go left and right. And the green areas that form a horseshoe around the headwaters of Shasta Lake, those are vegetation refugia. So the species that are moving out might not be the ones that can use the habitats in those refugia, but those refugia look like they're more stable locations. And so this suggests that there's going to be some large-scale movement, and there's places that we could look for prioritizing connectivity and prioritizing restoration. I didn't even really talk about the fire, and prioritizing preservation of some locations. And so with that, I'll say thank you, and that was fast. And I can take a couple questions if
Thanks, Jim.
people would like it.
Yeah, and I know, Jim, you have to run, but we do have just a couple of quick ones, I think, if you want to take a question or two. Okay.
Yeah.
I have one that's a little bit more technical and one that's kind of asking about your thoughts on a topic. So I'll give you both of these. The first kind of more technical question is asking about if you can kind of define climate water deficit and what that means. The question was, is it the amount of projected precipitation that would exist under current conditions versus amount of precip under climate scenarios? So I think just a question around what exactly that means.
Okay. Well, so climatic water deficit is something that plant ecologists like, and it basically is saying how thirsty would the plant be given a current temperature and a certain amount of moisture. So plants want to, their metabolic condition is to evapotranspirate, but they're limited in how much evapotranspiration they can do by how much moisture is in the soil. It's not how much precipitation comes, it's actually how much is retained in the soil for use. And so it's a measure of plant stress. Climatic water deficit is, and so if, under future climate change, we expect more cloud burst and sudden rainstorms. We might get the same amount of rain, but if it all occurs in a narrow window of time, then a lot of that's going to run off and it's not really available for plant use. And so climatic water deficit is nice because it kind of integrates a temperature and a moisture value to give us an estimate of how impacted plants might be.
Okay, we have a couple questions about where to find the paper and your work, so I'll make sure to get those answered for everyone. But before you go, we have a question from Steve. He asks, what exactly does this mean for vegetation in the Western Sierra, which seems to be on the non-refugia side of things?
Well, I think that's a great question. So, this is a place-based metric, and it's really, it's contextual for, I think it's most useful as a context when you're looking at regional plans. So if you're looking at regional plans, I think in any given location, the money decision for the people that are managing that is, am I managing to retain what's here, or am I going to try and allow things to change because it may not be possible to retain them? And I was showing end century, but 2040 is often what we're looking at planning for, or mid-century. And so the data that show how much stress is going on by that time might be appropriate for a localized plan. And it's not the only thing that you want to look at. There's lots of other things like, oh, well, how important is this habitat? If it's a really important habitat, then you want to try and build the resilience for it. And how would you do that? Is it a prescribed burn, or is it, slope stabilization, or, there's lots of different reasons that we look at landscapes. And I would say that this gives us a place-based estimate. It doesn't tell us where, say, canyon live oak might move to, or red fir might move to. It's just saying, because resource managers are typically tied to the landscape and they have this money decision to make, maybe they can bring their management tools to bear and say, here's the places that on my landscape look like they're better equipped to just naturally to retain climatically, and there's other places that are higher stressed. And then that's something that you bring in for consideration along with all the other things that you're looking at for restoration, or for connectivity, or for preservation.
All right. Thank you. How's your timing looking, Jim?
Yeah, I think I'll jump off in another minute or so.
Okay. Well, we have, yeah.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to present, and it's awesome to see how many people are on the line here. So Whitney, you're doing an incredible job. Thank you so much. And you guys will get much more informed information from Melanie and Sandra. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. Thank you for joining. We really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right, have a good one. Great, and now we'll turn it over to you, Melanie and Sandra.
Okay, so thanks, Jim. That was a really great talk. And now Sandra Hill and I are going to jump into more detail on some work that we did applying the vegetation climate exposure models to species habitat models for California species. So today, just to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about, I'll give an overview of why and how we did the work that we did. And then I'll hand it over to Sandra Hill to talk about the methods and the maps. And finally, I'll talk about the analysis and summary of the results. So the vegetation climate vulnerability study that Jim just talked about was one of a series of climate vulnerability studies that have been done in the state. So we also have climate vulnerability studies for the major animal taxonomic groups, mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, as well as fish and a subset of plants. The vulnerability studies score the predicted climate risk to each species based in part on models of how the animal's distributions might shift in a changing climate. And the models focus on the climate envelope of the animal species, but these models that were used in those reports did not explicitly look at how climate might also in parallel be impacting the habitats that those species use. So one suggestion that was made for improving those climate vulnerability analyses was to evaluate how the habitats on which the species depend might change. And the vegetation climate vulnerability study provided data to begin doing that. The second reason why we undertook this study was because in 2015 and 2016, we were in a historic extreme drought. CDFW had been working to identify species and populations at risk due to drought and identifying areas where surveys, monitoring, or other management actions were needed. We were asked what statewide map data we have to assist with that effort. And to look at all species across a statewide basis, we'd need to know where in the state each species is found, what habitat areas they would be using, and then we'd need maps of the impacts to those habitat areas. We did have data on species ranges and suitable habitats in the California Wildlife Habitat Relationships Program, or CWHR. The CWHR contains species range maps for about 700 terrestrial vertebrate species in California, so birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. and a habitat suitability matrix describing which habitats each species uses and how suitable those habitats are for different life requisites, including cover, so hiding and resting places, reproduction, and feeding. Sandra is going to show an example of one of these tables in a minute. We did not, for the drought, have detailed maps showing which habitat areas were being most impacted in real time on a statewide basis. In the absence of statewide maps of real-time drought impacts, we were looking for other statewide data sets that might be useful. So the climate exposure models include maps that predict the vegetation types and locations to be most impacted over time in a hotter and drier future climate, which is associated with more frequent drought. So these maps wouldn't tell us where the impacts are during any specific drought or other weather event, but it could help us in prioritizing long-term monitoring. So based on the data sets that we had available, we wanted to ask these questions. So which species have the least vegetation refugia available at the end of the century, and which species have the most vegetation refugia available at the end of the century? Also, which species are predicted to be impacted first by habitat exposure or climate exposure to their habitats in a warmer and drier future climate? And which species are habitat specialists in habitats ranked as highly climate vulnerable? So now I will pass it on to Sandra Hill to talk about the methods, models, and maps.
Hello, good morning. My name is Sandra Hill, as Melanie mentioned, and I am a GIS specialist that works with the Conservation Analysis Unit. I've been doing GIS work in support of conservation biology projects for the department since I came on board just over 20 years ago. And I'm here today to talk to you about the methods used to create the GIS data for this project. Due to the scope of the project and the number of species that we will be working with, we decided that our best approach would be to write scripts to do the geoprocessing for us. This would both automate the processing and give us a record of exactly what was done. So it allows the update of the data in the future, should the need arise, and also gets to the transparency and reproducibility that we strive for in all of our projects at CDFW. The scripts were written in Python 2.7 and run in ArcMap 10.5. I wrote them as a series of short modules rather than as one complete script, as this allows for iterative changes, and it lets us refresh one set of outputs without needing to rerun all of the other pieces. So this is a big time saver when you consider that we are working with a suite of over 700 species. So our starting point was the suite of Cwhr range maps, which represent the maximum current geographic extent of each terrestrial species found in California. And these ranges were developed using various sources of observed occurrence data, expert opinion, and then were vetted by a series of species experts in California. So this one, as you can see, is for the California tiger salamander. And here on the left, you see a simpler view of that same range map for the tiger salamander. So our next step was to select our vegetation layer. And we also chose, as Jim did, the FVeg data set from Cwhr, as it's currently the best available statewide vegetation set for California. It incorporates data from many different sources, including our own vegetation and classification mapping program. So the script cycled through each of the species range maps from Cwhr in turn, and it clipped the FVeg data to create a new data set for each species of all the vegetation types within the ranges. Next, we needed to filter this down to just the habitat types used by the species in question. To do this, we looked at the Cwhr habitat matrix of species and habitat types. Melanie mentioned this earlier, that this is a matrix of those two things crosswalked. And from this matrix, we exported separate tables for each of our individual species. So as you can see in this example, the tables include a list of habitat types that are used by each species, as well as suitability ratings, which are based on, as you mentioned, breeding, foraging, and other such considerations. So each of the habitat types is also assigned a Cwhr code, which you can see in the leftmost column of the table. And the first three letters of this code describe the habitat, such as AGS for annual grasslands, or BOW for blue oak woodlands. And the last two digits describe the cereal stage, tree size, density, that sort of information. So these same codes are also found in the FVeg dataset. I should mention here that this is not a complete table for the tiger salamander that you're seeing, but rather just a portion of that table that I wanted to use here as an example. So our script ran through and joined for each of the clipped versions of FVeg that we generated the corresponding habitat tables by joining on that Cwhr code field. And it kept only the cells that had a match between the dataset and the table. So what this gives us is a dataset of habitat types used by the species that is constrained to the area within the species range. As you can see in this example, the only habitat types used by the tiger salamanders, or rather the habitat types used by the tiger salamanders have been retained in this example, and all the other types have been dropped out. So that leaves us with empty areas in the range, which are shown as white in the map. These are areas where the habitat types present were not identified as appropriate for this salamander. We can also use the suitability scores from the table to classify the habitat suitability for the species, as we've done here, by grouping them into high, medium, and low bins. Once we have these predicted habitat distribution models, now we're ready to consider what the climate impacts might be and how they might come into play. So, as you heard in the first section of this talk, Jim Thorne's group created a range of predicted climate exposure models based on different emission scenarios and different timelines. We had 8 of these models to work with in our project, and you can see one of them here. Our scripts were written to allow us to choose any one of the 8 climate exposure models and see how it would apply to our full suite of species. In order to do this, we needed to cycle through the predicted habitat models that we created earlier and spatially extract the climate score for each habitat pixel from the same location in our selected climate model. And this gives us a unique predicted climate exposure model for each one of our species. So you can see in this map how this particular climate scenario model looks for the tiger salamander. The predicted areas of low exposure are shown in green in this map, and the areas of predicted high exposure are shown here in dark red. We then ran through the script using each of the remaining 7 scenarios, and that gave us a picture of how each species would look under each of the scenarios, how each one would be impacted. So here again, you see the tiger salamander and our 8 examples. So you heard Jim discussing refugia earlier, and that's something that we were also interested in, and we felt it would be useful to see which areas in the state were predicted to have low exposure values across all the climate scenario models for the different time periods modeled. So here you see the results of the analysis that we did, with the map on the left showing the areas where all 4 of the models forecasted for the time period of 2040 to 2069 showed low exposure. So each of those green pixels was rated low exposure in all 4 of those climate models. And the map on the right shows the areas where the 4 models forecasted for the time period of 2070 to 2099 rather, also show low exposure. So 2 different time periods for refugia, split basically just after mid-century and then end of century. And as with the previous example, which extracted predicted level of exposure for each climate model, we could run that same process here with the refugia models, and that would give us areas of predicted refugia for each one of those species as well. So at this point in the project, we had a full suite of data, models for 700 species using 8 different climate models and refugia, and we needed to begin analyzing the data to see what it could tell us. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Melanie for this piece, as she did all of the heavy lifting of teasing out patterns and effects of this mountain of data. So Melanie, back to you.
All right, thank you, Sandra. Okay, so now we'll take a look at what the results showed and how we can summarize those. So as Sandra mentioned, in the end, we had models that for the habitat of 662 species, and we had to exclude 140 of those from the final analysis because the majority of the mapped potential habitat was in urban, agricultural, aquatic, or marine habitats that were not modeled in the vegetation climate vulnerability study. So we assessed the extent of spatially explicit climate exposure to suitable habitat for each of our 522 species that met our requirement of having more than 50% of their habitat assessed. And we had 8 climate exposure maps, as Sandra mentioned, for each of those species. So we had 4 maps at mid-century and 4 at end of century. And the results I will be discussing focus mostly on the end of century results, but the mid-century models are also available. So the 4 end of century results that I'll be talking about are for the hotter and drier scenario and the warmer and wetter scenario at both high, each of those at both high and low emissions levels. So here's the mean percentage of suitable habitat across all 522 animal species that is predicted to have high climate exposure at the end of the century. So this is pretty similar to one of the slides that Jim showed earlier, where they calculated overall how much habitat would be impacted in these different scenarios. So this is looking at species predicted to, so you can see here that the percentage is much higher with high emissions than with lower emissions. So in a hot and dry scenario, about 14% of the more habitat is high exposure. And in a warm and wet scenario, about 30% more habitat is impacted under a high emissions scenario versus a low emissions scenario. And looking at those results as far as numbers of species, this table shows the number of species predicted to have high climate exposure within the majority of their suitable habitat at the end of the century under the different scenarios. So for the purposes of this summary, we're looking at species for which more than 50% of their mapped suitable habitat falls in the greater than 95% exposure category. So in a hotter and drier scenario, you can see that there's 17 or 18 species with more than 50% of their habitat in high exposure areas at the end of the century. And if you include non-analog habitat in that, that triples to 62. And as a reminder, the non-analog exposure is where the climate will fall outside the range of conditions currently found in California. So the impact of these new conditions on species is more difficult to predict because we don't have anything to compare it with within the state. In a warmer and wetter future, we have 5 or 6 species with high exposure under a low emission scenario. And those numbers increase by an order of magnitude in a high emissions scenario and up to 184 with non-analog habitat. And then finally, the bottom row of the table shows how many species have refugia across the majority of their habitat at the end of the century. So under low emissions, it's about 200 to 300 species out of the 522 that we assessed. But under high emissions, that number goes down significantly to 22 and 7. So the take-home message here is that you can see a direct relationship between the emissions levels and the impacts to species habitats, both in the amount of habitat with high exposure and in the amount of refugia available. So all of these results are available in our project report. There's a giant table in there that has it listed out on a species by species basis. So for this presentation, I'll be highlighting the results for a few example species. But if you want to dig deeper or find the results for a specific species, you can find this table in our project report. So next we'll focus in even further to those species that have highest exposure across the majority of their suitable habitat, regardless of future climate scenario. So whether it's hotter and drier or warmer and wetter, which species are predicted to have the greatest impacts to their habitats. So we found 60 species predicted to have high climate exposure or non-analog conditions across the majority of their habitat, regardless of future climate scenario. So on the left here, you can see the number of species by taxonomic group, and you can see that the number is relatively small if you're just looking at high exposure, and if you include non-analog habitat, the number goes up significantly. And on the right, you can see the percentage of the species assessed by taxonomic group. So the percentage of species in the taxonomic group that are impacted. And that was 11% for amphibians, 8% for birds, 9% for mammals, and 30% for reptiles. The high number for reptiles is likely due to the large amount of non-analog habitat in the deserts. And so further understanding of what those non-analog results mean is important. I wanted to mention that 4 of these 60 species were also identified as climate vulnerable in other studies. And it might be important to include this information in the next update of these climate vulnerability assessments, because this might add information for the 56 species that weren't already identified as climate vulnerable. So if you look across all of the future climate scenarios and emissions levels, there were 4 species that were predicted to have high exposure across the majority of their suitable habitat, regardless of future climate scenario or emissions level. So even if we were able to reduce emissions significantly, these species still show high impacts or large amounts of their habitat impacted by climate exposure. So you can see that they're all toad species that occur in the southeastern deserts of California, primarily in the Sonoran and Colorado deserts, but some of them also extend into the Mojave Desert. One of these, Couch's spadefoot toad, was identified as climate vulnerable in the report in the reptile and amphibian climate vulnerability assessment. And future assessments should incorporate these results into assessing vulnerability for these other 3 species. But it's not all bad news. There were some species with refugia across the majority of their suitable habitat at the end of the century. We identified 25 species with refugia across the majority of their suitable habitat in at least one future climate scenario. And these 4 species had refugia across the majority of their suitable habitat in all future climate scenarios. So these are species that occur in the Northern California and also on the Central Coast in some of those climate refugia areas. So you might have noticed that all of the species on the last 2 slides were amphibians. One of the reasons that all of these species, that have their entire range within a climate exposure area or a climate refugia area might be because amphibians tend to have small ranges. And overall species with small ranges are at a higher overall risk as climate changes because they have fewer opportunities to move and find refugia, unless, of course, their entire range happens to fall within a refugia area, such as is predicted for these 4 species. So can this data help tell us which species we should focus in on first? As we mentioned, the climate results were run at 4 different scenarios, and they were also run in different time steps. So next I'm going to zoom in on species predicted to have the greatest climate exposure impact at the nearest time step. And the results I'll show next are what's expected over the next 2 decades based on a hotter and drier climate scenario with a reduced emission scenario. So this is the most conservative model, if you will, since it's the nearest term time step and it uses the reduced emission scenario. It shows the least amount of climate exposure among all of the scenarios that we looked at. So looking at the least amount of climate exposure, which species are still showing high exposure within their habitats. So even with the reduced emission scenario, we found 22 terrestrial species for which 20% or more of their suitable natural habitat is projected to have high climate exposure over the next 2 decades. And 16 of these species were found in the North Coast, such as this species here, Dunn's salamander. So in the map on the left, you can see the habitat for Dunn's salamander, the Cwhr Habitat Suitability Map, which shows the habitat in green, high, medium, and low suitability from dark green to yellow. And then on the right, you can see the climate exposure values for these habitats, with red being high exposure, moderate being orange, and then green being areas of refugia. So you can see that for this species, essentially all of the potential habitat is classed as high climate exposure or greater than 95%, with some areas in the moderate category and no visible areas on the map of refugia. Dunn's salamander was also identified as climate vulnerable and as a CDFW drought priority species. So all of these assessments are pointing to the fact that this species is at risk and that its habitat is likely to be significantly impacted. So here's another one of the 16 North Coast species. This is Townsend's mole, and this species, along with Townsend's vole, which has a similar distribution, also was modeled to have high climate exposure across more than 50% of its potential suitable habitat in the next 2 decades under a hotter and drier future. You can see in the climate exposure map for this species on the right that there are some areas in gray. So the areas in gray are areas that weren't modeled. For this species, it's areas of cropland pasture and irrigated hay fields. So these areas, because they're modified and they aren't natural habitats, they weren't assessed in the vegetation climate vulnerability models. These areas might provide some level of refugia for the species due to irrigation and management, but it's important to keep in mind that not all of the habitat was assessed when interpreting the results that we show here, but you can see that the majority of natural suitable habitat is predicted to have high climate exposure for this species. And in addition to the 16 North Coast species, we identified 6 other species for which high climate exposure was predicted across more than 20% of their suitable habitat over the next 2 decades. And these species occurred in grasslands, wet meadows, and riparian areas in the Sierra Nevada and Cascades and in the mountains of Southern California. So these were white-eared pocket mouse, shown here, and then also San Gabriel slender salamander, vagrant shrew, Southern California slender salamander, Mazama pocket gopher, and Switax banded gecko. So we have these tables in the report that have information about each of the species. So this is the 22 species that we identified as potentially being impacted first. And it shows the species name, whether or not it's been identified as a climate vulnerable species, whether it was identified as a drought priority species, if it's aquatic, if it has narrowly distributed habitat, and then also its total range area, the area of suitable habitat within its range, and the percent of natural habitat with high climate exposure. And we have tables in the report that show these results for all 522 species. So finally, I'm going to talk about habitat specialists and highly vulnerable vegetation types. So Jim mentioned in his talk that in addition to the vegetation exposure models, they also did an overall vulnerability analysis for each vegetation type, which was broader than the exposure scores and incorporated exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity for each vegetation type. So looking at these kind of holistic results for per vegetation type, we looked at habitat specialists that occur within these types. And we defined our habitat specialists as species for which 5 or fewer Cwhr habitat types are defined as highly suitable, and where generally greater than half of their high suitability habitat is of a single type. And we found 24 species that were habitat specialists within vegetation types that were ranked as mid-high to highly vulnerable based on the Vegetation Vulnerability Report. So the first of these is redwood, and Dunn's salamander, which was one of the slides a couple of slides ago, is a specialist within redwood habitat. Also, marbled murrelet nests in redwood habitat, and marbled murrelet was actually not one of the species that we included. It's one of the 140 species that we didn't assess. So this assessment might not be comprehensive of all species that are specialists within these habitats, but it gives us a starting point to start looking at. So we also had subalpine conifer. The species identified for subalpine conifer were Mount Lyell shrew, alpine chipmunk, and Uinta chipmunk. Pinyon juniper, the species were Panamint chipmunk and Inyo shrew. Salt marsh was salt marsh harvest mouse. Valley foothill riparian was yellow-billed cuckoo, Bell's vireo, and yellow-breasted chat. Wet meadow was black-toed willow flycatcher and Townsend's pocket gopher. Annual grassland was California tiger salamander, grasshopper sparrow, giant kangaroo rat, Stevens kangaroo rat, and Nelson's antelope ground squirrel. Sagebrush was greater sage grouse, pygmy rabbit, dark kangaroo mouse, and Ord's kangaroo rat. And coastal sage scrub was island night lizard. So all of these habitat types are ranked as mid-high to highly vulnerable in the report, and they have some habitat specialist species that occur primarily within these habitat types. So that might be another consideration when next updating the climate vulnerability studies for animal species. So all of these results and more are available in our project report. The link to the project report was included in the ad for the talk, or you can contact Sandra Hill or me to get the link. The GIS datasets are also publicly available. The Cwhr species habitat models are all available for download from the CDFW BIOS website. The climate exposure maps per species are not available on BIOS because there were simply too many to post, but they are available by request if you contact Sandra or me. And also a version of the vegetation refugia data that Jim discussed and Sandra also showed is available in ACE in the climate resilience category. So some final thoughts. The vegetation vulnerability and species habitat exposure maps can inform future updates of species climate vulnerability assessments. They can also help prioritize monitoring. Expanding the analysis outside the California border would allow us to better address non-analog areas and get a better idea of what we expect to happen in those areas and how species might be able to adapt. And finally, I think that we're getting closer to being able to bring together the vegetation exposure maps, shifts in vegetation distribution, predicted vegetation distribution under future climates. And we didn't talk about this today, but there is some information on that included in Jim's report, his vegetation vulnerability analysis, and shifts of animal species distribution. So looking at all of those together will give us a better idea of where species will be able to persist in the landscape and where suitable habitats might occur for them in the future as their distributions shift. So with that, I wanted to say thank you for your attention. And I also wanted to acknowledge that this part of the study that I just presented was funded in part by emergency drought response funding back in 2016. And now we can take some questions.
Great, thank you both, Melanie and Sandra. It was so nice to hear about these two projects and all these efforts kind of back to back, having you and Jim present. So you can actually see how they kind of feed off of one another. We do have lots of questions, so if you're ready, I'll just start kind of rapid firing these questions at you, and we can just see how many we can get through by the end of the hour, if that works for you.
Okay.
And these kind of came in throughout the presentation. There were several questions about how to access the reports and any data sets associated with them, which I think, Melanie, you kind of touched on at the end. And I was thinking maybe we could also post a link to BIOS or something on the lecture series website, or if there's any other specific links to data you want to post into the chat, or if you would like to pass those to me afterwards, feel free and we'll make sure everyone gets those. But I think you kind of covered where everything could be found.
Okay, sure.
So let's see here. First question is from Kelsey. She asked if it was appropriate to consider translocation of species as their refugia become disconnected and migration becomes unlikely. Can you speak to that at all?
So that's kind of a loaded question. So translocation of species has been talked about a lot in the literature and for helping species adapt to climate change. It's theoretically talked about a lot, but it hasn't been done very much in practice for a variety of different reasons. But I think that it's something that we're going to have to consider more over time, and that these types of data are the right data to look at to help inform where you might want to translocate species to.
Yeah, and along those lines, kind of in support of that question, I know, Melanie, you especially have been involved in a lot of conversations around connectivity and how can we facilitate movement that way for as many species as possible.
Right, yeah, and the example that Jim showed at the end of his talk, where he started looking at this climate change data, exposure data, and connectivity data, all combining it together to look at potential corridors that might be used to respond to climate change. That's the type of information that I think a lot of the connectivity analyses are starting to move in that direction. So there was just one completed down in Southern California a year or two ago that looked specifically at movement in response to climate change. So a lot of people and a lot of great minds are thinking about this.
All right, next question is from John. He asks about he says, what is the specific definition of reduced emissions? And kind of what does that mean in this context?
Right, so this, the emissions levels, they're given these numbers. So the ones that we looked at were RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. And it basically is different versions of the models that look at different amounts of carbon in the atmosphere, what will happen with different amounts of carbon, and then they've tied that directly to emissions. So if we can reduce our emissions by a certain amount, we can get down to this RCP 4.5 level. And I don't know all the details, but I do know that there are reports out there that that tie that exactly together with the emissions levels and what those numbers specifically mean. But for the purpose of this project, we chose RCP 8.5, which is a high emissions level, which now is pretty much the business as usual. So if we don't reduce emissions, that's the track that we're on. And then 4.5 is significantly reducing the amount of carbon in that being released into the atmosphere.
All right, our next question is from Rafika. She asks, what information would be needed to extend these vulnerability analyses to our 160 or so listed plant species? Or does the department already have enough information and it's just a matter of time?
So so let's see. I think that there could be ways to do it. There was one climate vulnerability analysis that I helped work on almost 10 years ago now that addressed a subset of our listed plant species. And I think that's something that it's possible to do. We just haven't completed it yet.
I'm going to ask this question as kind of a follow-up because it's related, but Sherilyn asked about whether or not there's a tool to predict vulnerability for specific species that wasn't included in the report. She said there used to be a tool through NatureServe, which I think is the Climate Change Vulnerability Index that we were able to use, but Climate Wizard has gone offline, and so the tool is kind of unusable without Climate Wizard. And I've been curious about this myself because I have not heard of any updates to Climate Wizard, but have you heard of anything, Melanie or Sandra, of other kind of tools that are available out there?
I haven't heard anything about tools that are similar to Climate Wizard, but that being said, I think that for California, we have all of the data that would go into Climate Wizard. So it should be possible to sort of recreate those same types of analyses. And it actually probably would be better to use it based on our California specific data than to use the Climate Wizard data, which I think was pretty broad scale general data and much coarser than the climate data that we have for California.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know at one point we were looking at how to kind of fit climate projections from CalAdapt, the state's website, into that vulnerability tool. And we're having a little bit of trouble with it, but maybe that's a conversation we can start with other partners about how we could go about that and make it really, kind of useful for California.
I wanted to make a point here too that we did run the full suite of CWHR species, as I mentioned, through the script. So any terrestrial species in California was run through this analysis. But then as Melanie mentioned in her summary analysis there were a number of them that we didn't carry forward through the analysis because the vegetation types that they depend on were not part of the climate assessment side. So we have the potential habitat distribution models for them, but because the climate piece wasn't complete for those specific species, that was why they were omitted. So it's not that the analysis wasn't done, it's that the climate link wasn't quite as it should have been for those species because of the urban and ag omission in the climate side. So.
Yeah, and I just thought of one more thing related to Rafika's question. So we don't have ranges or distribution maps for all of our listed plant species. So I think if we had that, we could run it through these same scripts that Sandra built, or a similar type of script to look at climate exposure within the habitats where the species are found. But we don't have those base maps like we had for the animal species in this case.
Yes, I would agree. The scripts, as I mentioned in the methods part, we can swap out the inputs and run them based on different climate models or refugia models or different species inputs. So running them for plants is just a matter of getting the correct inputs, the ranges or distribution models. But yeah, that can certainly be done if we have the input data.
All right, next question comes from Robert. He asks, here he says, we know that redwoods once grew in the San Gabriel Mountains. Can we go back in time and analyze vegetation changes to the present as a test of effectiveness and continuity of our current models for that region?
So like back casting, sort of?
Yeah, that's kind of my interpretation is, can we see how well these, models are performing in terms of what is actually, vulnerable or changing maybe compared with what we've seen over the last few decades?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So someone should do that.
It's possible.
Sure.
But I do know that that's one way that they develop the climate models as a whole, is they look back over time at the history of climate, and then they see which of the models which are projecting into the future are most accurately also projecting or backcasting into the past. So people are using that method in other contexts.
Okay, one more question here from Anika. She says, great work. I'm wondering if this vulnerability assessment will be followed up with recommendations or approaches for managing for climate adaptation.
Yeah, I think, so we did follow up with examples of how it could be used in the Frontiers paper. And I think that developing some recommendations is also a great idea. And that's something that Whitney probably also interested in. So
yeah, I can add to that. So in the Science Institute, we're kind of currently working on our multi-year action plan for what we're going to be working on the next few years. And one of those things is scaling some of this information to our lands to see where some of those biggest vulnerabilities are, climate vulnerabilities, and then also developing just what you're talking about, kind of some adaptation strategies that we can employ. And we would be basing that on exactly this work that Melanie's done and other information that we have within the department. So yes, there are plans to develop kind of recommendations and action-oriented plans that we can start implementing at the department. All right, it looks like we do have a couple of quick follow-up questions. So I know we have just a few minutes here, but Rafika had a quick follow-up on her plant question. She asked if the range or distribution of some of those species could be modeled using CNDDB occurrence data.
Yeah, so people have done that for some species, and NatureServe recently modeled a bunch of listed species, including plants, and so those models exist and can be potentially accessed and refined. There are people creating models, so I believe David Ackerley's lab at UC Berkeley just developed models for all California plant species, so it might be able to get some of them there. The issue with some of these projects that model thousands of species at once, like the NatureServe project did and Ackerley's project, is that they're not refined for an individual species. So you'd want to go in and refine it for your species, but at least you would have a starting point.
Okay, thanks for the follow-up on that one. And then we have time, I think, for one more question. And this last question comes in from Angelina. She said, it looks like the map areas for species were first based on current ranges of species, and then we looked at changes within that current range. And she asks, did you look at connected habitats along the edges of their current ranges that are maybe outside of their current habitat, where the species may be able to go for refugia?
Well, we did use current ranges. That's absolutely correct. We used the CWHR current range and then pulled habitat within it. We could certainly decide on a buffer for those ranges if we wanted to expand out a specified area, like 1 mile outside or 5 miles outside the range. So we could expand the range and then run the scripts again, and they would consider the entire range plus the buffer. So that certainly can be done without too much trouble, if that would be of use.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of data sets that could be brought together. And I think that the work that Jim showed at the end, they've started doing that to some extent, but I think that there's definitely opportunity for further work on this. So now for all of our animal species, we have these, we have the habitat data. We have in the vegetation or in the climate vulnerability reports, they have species distribution models that show current suitable conditions and where those conditions are going to move in the future. So we kind of have current and future range type of data. And for the vegetation types, because what this climate exposure data doesn't tell you is like, if it's high exposure, what is it going to change into? You know, it's going to change potentially have type conversion and change into something else. But we have some information that we could potentially glean from the vegetation vulnerability report, where they did do those same types of species distribution models for the vegetation types and then forecast them into the future. So where do we think the vegetation type is going to move? So I think that there's a lot of data available, and there's opportunity for someone to dig into that data and bring it all together into kind of a holistic view of what's going to be happening with the habitat, what's happening with the species, to hone in our predictions and look at connectivity. But as far as I know, nobody has done that yet.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, I do want to acknowledge one more comment in the chat from Laura. She said that she would really appreciate kind of a technical talk or demo where managers could be shown how to use some of the data sets that you talked about, that she sees kind of how powerful this information is, but could really use help in kind of how to look through some of it. So I just put that out there as a kind of a final comment. Maybe we can think about that and look for more of those opportunities.
Okay.
All right. Well, before I close this out, any final comments or thoughts, Melanie or Sandra? Top of mind. Okay.
Well, I wanted to say thanks for hosting us. It's been fun to talk about this project. It was a really fun project to work on. And it is available. The report's available. We'll get the link out to you. And again, the data for the predicted habitat distributions is available in BIOS. And the refugia layers that I showed are available through ACE, the ACE viewer or BIOS viewer. And as Melanie mentioned earlier, the GIS data from all of these species analysis are available upon request. Just reach out to Melanie or myself, and we're happy to share it with you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to come share this with this group.
Yes. Of course, and thank you both. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic, so we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with everyone about this today. So thank you so much, Melanie and Sandra, for being here, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Again, please keep an eye out for the recording on our website, and please join us in January for our next talk. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.